Sasquatch is 100% legit.
Sasquatch.
Correct.
Why have no hunters ever killed a Sasquatch?
There's an ape in China that nobody saw for decades because it would hide out.
Oh,
of the
that's where
Sasquatch.
the ape side comes
That's
in.
where it, boom. He's like a bear. He has the same
No.
dot.
You
has the same
said
dot.
he was an ape. Now you're saying that Sasquatch is a bear. Sasquatch is actually an ape, and he's also a little bit of a bear and an eagle.
No.
So they'll
you're
come down with their talons.
You're
on
being
you.
crazy.
I'm being crazy.
It helps if you have females with you because they're more attracted to feminine voices.
Oh,
And-
so I'm gonna go into the woods with my wife, and if Sasquatch comes around, I'm fine because they're gonna eat Nicole instead of me.
No. They'll probably beat you up and take Nicole back with you.
Captive?
No, as a member of the community.
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 That's what they call them?
Tribes.
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 Tribes of Sasquatchies.
Tribe of Sasquatchin
Have you met people that have seen them?
on TV.
Yeah, those are the guys we hired on staff here at Parker Hill to raise up the next generation. It's great. I love Danny and Carl. They do a great job with our students, and they're a lot of fun to work with, and our kids love them, and they're doing some amazing things in the life of our church, including, as was already mentioned, the kickoff party that's happening this weekend, so be sure to get your middle and high school students there. They do not want to miss that. Hey, great to have you here today, and I know that every single week at Parker Hill, we have people walking in the doors for the very first time, and if that's you, if you're new here, if you're a guest with us, we are so glad you're here. Welcome. And I just hope this is a place where you can connect with the heart of God and take a step in His direction. Maybe today will be the first of many steps. But you may not have realized until you came today that we are actually one church in 3 locations. So we meet in 3 places. We meet in Wilkes-Barre, Dixon City, and Clark Summit, Pennsylvania. And one of the ways that we stay connected as a church is by using video for our teaching every Sunday so that we can share the same teaching across 3 different campuses. So whichever campus you happen to be attending this weekend, so glad to have you here for week number 3 in this series called Money Myths. And during this series, we're talking about some of the lies that we believe when it comes to this area of our lives. Because just as there are some people who believe crazy things about Sasquatch, there are also lots of people who believe some crazy things about money. And so during this series, we're addressing some of the lies that our culture tells us every single day when it comes to our money and our possessions. Now, let me just acknowledge right up front, as I have done every week in this series, that what we're talking about sometimes makes people a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit nervous, because, you know, when you talk about money, that's such a personal and such an emotional subject. But if you haven't been around here for very long, you need to know that here at Parker Hill, we don't shy away from subjects that are difficult or controversial. We just choose to address them head on because that's exactly what Jesus did. And so we are addressing head on some of the things that we believe in our culture about money. So let me do a little bit of review in case you haven't been here or if you've forgotten what we talked about already. We began this series 2 weeks ago, and I started with this kind of foundational principle. And this is just a principle of life, that a firm decision based on a flawed assumption will always lead to a wrong conclusion. In other words, you can make the most logical decision in the world, but if you make that decision based on bad information, based on a flawed assumption, it will not go well for you. It never does. And that's true in every area of life, including this area of life that we're talking about, which is our money, our finances. In fact, let me give you one example from the realm of finances. This is a true story. There was a woman just a few years ago who decided to buy a gift for her mom, a new mattress, because her mom was in her 70s and she had been sleeping on the same mattress literally for decades. And so one day when her mom was out of the house, she goes to the store. Without telling her mom, she buys the mattress, she brings it home, she sets it up, she takes the old mattress out to the curb, puts it out with the trash. And later that night, her mom comes home, and her daughter tells her about the new gift she's gotten her, and her mom freaked out because she had been storing her life savings inside that old mattress. And I'm not making this up, she had almost $1 million in her mattress. In fact, let me show you a picture. The people that owned the landfill got a crew together to go out and search for the mattress, but unfortunately, they never found it. You see, she was operating by a flawed assumption. She believed that the safest place to keep her money was in her mattress, And that flawed assumption ended up creating a lot of problems for her because a firm decision based on a flawed assumption will always lead to a wrong conclusion. And so we've been tackling some of the flawed assumptions, some of the myths, some of the lies that we believe in our culture. So we began 2 weeks ago with myth number one. Myth number one is this. We talked about this, that myth number one is, I just need a little more. And this is the idea that, I will be happy if I can just get a little more money, a little more stuff, a few more possessions. And this myth is one that just kind of permeates our culture. It's like the air that we breathe. And so many people are chasing after this myth, but what we eventually discover is that more doesn't really make us happier. It just makes us more tired, more financially strapped, deeper in debt, and more disappointed. That's a myth. And then last week we talked about myth number two. Myth number two says it's wrong to be rich. Let me tell you why that's a myth. Number one reason why that's a myth is this: you already are. And if you weren't here last week, you missed the good news. You really are rich. I know you don't feel like it. I know we don't think we are, but we really are, because we live in the most prosperous nation in the world. And last week I mentioned to you that if you make at least $33,000 a year in income, you are in the top 1% of wage earners in the world. You're a 1%er. Now, if you haven't done so yet, go home, go on that website I mentioned, globalrichlist.com, type in your information, and rejoice in the fact that you really are rich. And that's the good news. Here's the bad news. The bad news is this: it's not wrong to be rich, but it is dangerous. We talked about this last week, that for those of us who are rich people, which is all of us, there's some dangers in being rich. And the number one danger in being rich is this one, that our pride can escalate. That when you experience a lot of success in your life, that when things are going really well for you, when you begin to acquire things in your life, then you begin to think that your success is all because of you. And we begin to forget that if it weren't for God's grace, if it weren't for His help, we would not even have the next breath that we take. And I mentioned to you last week that any blessing that we don't turn to praise will eventually turn to pride. So it's not wrong to be rich, but it is dangerous because our pride can escalate. But then this happens as well: our hope can migrate. And we talked about the fact that when life is going well and when you have a lot, what happens is you begin to put your hope not in God, but you put your hope in your stuff, right? Because you got the good salary and you got the insurance and you got the investments, and you don't really need God anymore. And like I've said so many times, we have chaplains in hospitals and we have chaplains in the armed forces, but we don't have chaplains at country clubs. And we don't have chaplains at cocktail parties, right? Because when things are going really well, we don't think we need God. And when you become rich, when you become successful, and we all are, we're all rich because we're Americans, our hope can migrate. Okay, so that's the review. That's what we talked about the first 2 weeks. And if you missed any of those messages, you can go online and you can listen to those. Now, every week, what we've been doing is we've been reciting kind of a collective declaration. Because the only way to really combat a myth, to combat a lie, is with the truth. So we have this statement that we've been saying, and we've been building on this every week. It says this: that God has blessed me with more than I need. I am rich. I will not trust in my riches, but in Him who richly provides. And just to cement that in your mind one more time, I'm going to have you say that with me on all 3 campuses. Okay, this is an all play. And when we get to this part, I want you to say, I am rich. I mean, say this like you really mean it, okay? Here we go. We're going to say this together. 1, 2, 3, go. God has blessed me with more than I need. I am rich. I will not trust in my riches, but in Him who richly provides. And at the end of our time, we're going to come back to that. We're going to give you one more statement at the end of that, and we're going to say that one more time, okay? Today, we're going to jump into the third money myth. And the third myth is this: the church just wants my money. This one's going to be fun. Now, some of you may have never said this, but maybe you thought this. Or maybe you know somebody who says, you know what, I don't go to church anymore because the church just wants my money. And I've always thought that this is kind of odd. It's odd to hear people say that, because I've never heard anybody say this. I've never heard anybody say, you know what, I don't go to Walmart anymore because they just want my money. You wouldn't say, yeah, I'm going to watch the Super Bowl. When those commercials come on, I'm just going to turn those off because those advertisers, they just want my money. And you're going to do that because the commercials are the best part, right? See, we don't really say this about anything except church, and I think sometimes it's a defense mechanism to kind of keep God at a distance. But I think this is a myth. Now, I can't speak for every church, and there may be churches out there, and there may be TV ministries and things about whom this is true. But I can say, at least here, this would be a myth. But rather than me responding to this myth, I just want to let the Bible speak to it. I want to let Scripture speak for itself. So we're going to go back to the same passage that we've been in every single week during this series, 1 Timothy chapter 6. And if you have a Bible with you, you can open it up, or you can bring that up on your phone or bring that up on your tablet. And while you're doing that, in case you're not familiar with the Bible, let me just give you some background to this part of the Bible. There are two letters in the Bible, in what we call the New Testament, 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy. They're written by Paul, a key leader in the early church, to a guy named Timothy. And Timothy was a pastor in the city of Ephesus in the first century. In fact, if you were to visit the country of Turkey today, you could walk through the ruins of the city of Ephesus. This is where Timothy lived. And he led the Christian church here in the city of Ephesus, which was growing very, very quickly in the first century. And Timothy was young. He had no leadership experience. And so Paul gives him some leadership coaching from a distance by writing these letters to him, helping him to understand what it looks like to lead the church and what it looks like to help these new Christians understand what it really means to follow Christ. And in chapter 6, I think we find some of the most amazing wisdom about money anywhere in the Bible. And I want to read just 3 verses for you, then we'll come back and we'll walk through them a little bit more slowly as we answer this third myth, beginning in verse 17. He says, Timothy, command those who are rich in this present world, that's you and I, we talked about that last week, not to be arrogant nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Verse 18, command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. Okay? Well, let's talk about this myth. The myth is the church just wants my money. Now, here's the first way that I would respond to this myth. I would say, no, it's not that the church just wants my money. It's that the world needs our generosity. It really does. This is a broken world full of hurting people that need truth and need hope. And the only way that we're going to make a difference in this world is if we're willing to be generous people who are willing to share. Let me go back to verse 18. It says, command them, not suggest to them, not encourage them, not drop hints. Command them, these believers who are rich in this present world, command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. And so Paul writes this letter and he says, Timothy, listen, I want you to command the believers there in the city of Ephesus to look beyond themselves, to see the world around them, and not just to pile up their riches, but to share them with the people around them. Because Ephesus needs their generosity. This world needs our generosity. Let me go back to what we talked about 2 weeks ago when we began this series. Do you remember all those cups from 7-Eleven that we had out here on the platform? And I said that this is like kind of a micro story of our culture. That in our culture, as Americans, we seem to always be discontent. We always seem to want just a little bit more, you know, and the bigger house, the nicer cars, the better wardrobe. And so, you know, for a while, we're okay with the gulp-sized life, but then we need the big gulp, and then we move on to the super gulp, and then the double gulp, and then the extreme big gulp. It's like we're never happy, never content, and so we live this way constantly. I want to give you a different object to think about tonight. I want you to think about a pitcher. A pitcher. And here's what I believe. I would suggest to you that if you are a follower of Christ, I mean if you are an authentic follower of Christ, then you look at your life not as a container but as a pitcher. Meaning when God pours blessing into your life, your job is not to just absorb it, not to just keep it, not just to ratchet up your lifestyle, but to pour out that blessing to someone else. And so your goal as a follower of Christ is not just to have the biggest gulp in your neighborhood or the biggest gulp in your series of, relationships in your circle of friends, but your goal is to be like Christ, because the Bible says that Jesus poured himself out for us. And so our goal is not just to take in, but to be poured out and to pour out what we have, because the world needs our generosity. And Jesus spoke about this in a parable that he told, a very powerful, powerful story. We referenced it a couple of weeks ago. Luke chapter 12, it says he told them this parable. He said, the ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store. And in our culture, this would be like saying, I'm going to rent a few more storage units. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool. This very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? Now here's the amazing thing. You read this story and you see this man in this parable that Jesus tells, and he describes him as a fool, but this man in this parable is someone that in our culture as Americans, we would often describe as someone who was a great success. He worked hard. He planned well. He invested well, he was productive, and now he was reaping the rewards of his labor. So why does Jesus call him a fool? Well, verse 21, Jesus kind of steps back out of the story, and he gives the moral, he gives the point of the parable, and he says this. He says, this is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. See, the problem is not that he was successful. The problem is not all the barns. The problem was not his hard work. The problem was not his success. The problem was not his wealth. The problem was this, that he only stored up things for himself, that he lived his life as if he was a container, not a pitcher. And God says, you are a fool. See, I would suggest to you that maybe the reason why God has poured out so much on us as American Christians, maybe the reason why he has blessed us so much is so that we could bless other people. Maybe he calls us not just to absorb everything that we have, but just to be a blessing to others because we have been so blessed. Maybe that's the way we ought to be living. So I want to ask you this question. Are you a container or are you a pitcher? See, around here, we take an offering every week, as you know, and we encourage you from time to time to be generous with God's work in this place. Sometimes we encourage you to sacrifice for God's work in this place. Why do we do that? Because we just want your money? No. Here's why we do that. Because we want to see people find a way back to God. That's what we want to see. And let me tell you the economic reality of that. The only way we accomplish our mission is when God's people are generous. It's when we begin to live like pitchers, not containers, that we're able to have staff and buildings and we're able to have programs and to make an impact, not just here, but around the world. See, when God's people are generous and willing to share, that's when the mission is accomplished. That's when great things begin to happen. Let me just give you some examples, some things to celebrate. I mean, right here, like every month on average, we have about 900 kids and students who plug into our family ministries programming. And they're learning about God's heart for them. And they're learning about how to live a life that honors God. And I believe that we are changing a generation. Do you know why we can do that? Because of people who've been generous and willing to share. Do you know last year we were able to give away $30,000 to help people in this church and in our community who were facing some kind of financial crisis through our benevolence fund. And I don't say that to brag. I say that to celebrate the generosity of so many people in this place. And over in a village called Tumutumu in Kenya, there is a water system now that we've been able to build for them because that village of people did not have easy access to clean water. But now they do, and they're going to be able to thrive, and their kids are going to be able to thrive educationally because they're not having to make trips back and forth to a water source that's 2 hours away. But do you know why we can do that? Because there are so many people who are generous and willing to share and see themselves not as a container for God's blessing, but as a pitcher to pour it back out. And just last year, we were able to complete a school building down in Maluret, Haiti. This was a village where 80% of the kids in that village had never had access to any kind of school and are now able to go to school. Do you know why that happens? That happens because God's people are generous and willing to share. And we got an event coming up this next Friday night. I'm really excited about this. It's called Night to Shine. And Night to Shine is a prom night experience for people with special needs. And there's going to be dinner, and there's going to be dancing, and there's going to be paparazzi, but they're going to be friendly paparazzi, and it's going to be a great evening. And it's a way for us to just show the love of God in a very tangible way in our community. And do you know why things like that can happen? Things like that can happen because God's people are generous and willing to share, so that we have a building here, and we have a staff here, and we have volunteers, and we have people who are willing to fund that event specifically. See, we live in a broken world, and it's not just that the church wants your money. That's not the point. It's that the world needs our generosity. And the only way I believe that the deepest problems in our culture will ever be solved is through the work of the church. I believe literally that the church is the hope of the world. And I was thinking about this recently because I read an article this past week that said that the amount of donations that will be given to this year's presidential campaign will be $5 billion. $5 billion will be donated to the presidential election process. I mean, we're going to spend an enormous amount of money electing the next president. And I'm not against that. I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean, I'm glad we have a free country where we have a democracy like that. But here's my point. I just want you to remember this. In the next 9 months, with all the press coverage, with all the attention, with all the debate, with all the money that's going to be spent, remember this, that no political party can change a human heart. And there is no political leader that can save marriages or give people a moral compass. It is God, not government, that will change a human heart. And the deepest issues in our culture are not political issues. The deepest issues in our culture are moral issues, and they are spiritual issues. And that's why I believe the church is the only hope of the world, and I believe that the church is the best investment you can make, not just because the church wants your money, but because the world needs our generosity, and they need the hope and the message of the gospel. So that's my first response. Here's my second response to this myth. It's not that the church wants my money, but God just wants your heart. And see, the two cannot be separated. They just can't be separated. Go back to verse 18, 1 Timothy 6 again. He says, Timothy, command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age. Now, I want to stop there, and I just want to unpack that, because I think that's such a profound truth if we fully understand it. What was Paul saying here to Timothy, that those who are rich and generous and willing to share will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age? What does that mean anyway? Well, he was almost quoting verbatim, and he was echoing the words of Jesus. Do you remember what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6? He said this. He said, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. He says, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. You know, you've heard the old saying, you can't take it with you. You know what Jesus said? He said, you can't take it with you, but you can send it on ahead. You can store up treasure in heaven. What does that mean? Here's what it means to store up treasure in heaven. To store up treasure in heaven means that you take some of the time and some of the money that you would normally spend pursuing the American dream. You take some of what you would normally use for yourself to enhance your own lifestyle, and you use that to invest in God's kingdom. Because the only true treasure in heaven will be people who are there because of our influence. And so to invest in treasure in heaven is to invest in the hearts of people. And that's how you store up treasure in heaven. And in verse 21, Jesus goes on to say something that's amazing. He says this, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. In other words, he makes this very important point that there's this undeniable, unbreakable connection between our money and our heart. That wherever your treasure goes, your heart will automatically follow. It really will. And that's not just a spiritual principle, that's a life principle. I mean, think about this. Think about what would happen if you took your entire retirement portfolio and invested it in Apple Computer, right? You would have a deep emotional connection to Apple, wouldn't you? You'd be checking the stocks every day. You'd be reading up on their profit and loss statements. You'd be watching very carefully what happened with that company, because where your treasure is, your heart will follow. What happens when you dump a boatload of money into a brand new car? There's an emotional connection there with your heart, isn't there? And so the first time somebody runs into it with a shopping cart, you're depressed, right? Because that was your car and your treasure was in that thing. And wherever your treasure is, your heart's going to follow. And the same thing is true. When you're investing in God's kingdom, your heart's going to follow. That's where your heart's going to be. Your heart is going to be connected to the heart of God. And I find this to be true in my own life. Whenever I invest consistently in the things that God is doing in this world, I find my heart drawn to His heart. I begin to see this world through His eyes. Generosity begins to break the grip of materialism in my life. And so it's not just about the church wants my money, it's about this. God wants my heart. And the way He really gets a hold of my heart is when He gets a hold of the thing that may be most important to me, which is my money and my possessions. And then there's this amazing phrase here at the end of verse 19. I love this. It says, in this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age. And where your treasure is, that's where your heart is going to be, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. In other words, when you are generous and willing to share, that's when you take hold of life that is truly life. And this is such a countercultural message, isn't it? Because the message that we hear every day is that the way you take hold of life that's truly life is when you buy more, and when you own more, and when you hang on to more, and when you hoard more. And I'll tell you, that is not where you find life that is truly life. In fact, I read an interesting story this past week about a guy named Marcus Pearson. He was the inventor of a software game called Minecraft. Very, very popular on computer, on mobile app. Minecraft, very, very popular with kids. Well, in 2014, he sold his company to Microsoft. And Microsoft paid him $1.3 billion, with a B, billion dollars for that little game. And he suddenly had everything that any human being could ever want. He bought a $70 million house in Beverly Hills. And he's living a lifestyle that most people in our culture would envy. And they would look at him and they would say, yeah, that's how you take hold of life that is truly life. But last summer, he was on his Twitter account at like 4 something in the morning. And he posted some things on Twitter that just gave an opening into his heart in what was really going on in his heart. Like at 4:48 a.m., he said this: the problem with getting everything is that you run out of reasons to keep trying. 2 minutes later, he posted this. He said, hanging out with a bunch of friends and partying with famous people, able to do whatever I want. And I've never felt more isolated. 2 minutes later, at 4:52, he said this: found a great girl, but she's afraid of me and my lifestyle, and went with a normal person instead. See, the way you find life that is truly life is not by acquiring, not by having more, but maybe it happens by giving more and serving more. In fact, I want to show you a picture. I was in South Africa for a week. I just got back on Sunday night. And while I was in South Africa, I met this little guy. His name is Happy. He's an orphan, and this is an orphanage. He was abandoned by his parents when he was born because he's completely deaf and he has some learning disabilities. And he and I couldn't communicate at all. But we spent about 10 minutes playing Frisbee on the soccer field there at the orphanage. And I've never seen a kid with such a beautiful smile. And I'll tell you what, that 15 minutes may be some of the best 15 minutes of my life in 2016. I mean, I've got a good life. I've got a nice house, got a couple of cars. I mean, I take nice vacations. But you know what? All those material things, they don't even come close to the joy that comes when you're giving yourself away and when you're serving. That's when you take hold of the life that is truly life. So here's the myth. The church just wants my money. Now, I don't know. That may be true in some churches. I can't speak for every church. I can only speak for me. I can only speak for this church. And I would say in this church, that's a myth. That's not true. But I'll tell you what is true. What's true is this: The world needs our generosity desperately, and northeastern Pennsylvania needs our generosity, and God wants your heart. And let me stop here and say this. Whenever I talk about generosity, I know for some people it's very discouraging, because I know there are a lot of people in this church who want to be generous, but you don't think you can be because your finances are just kind of upside down and in such a mess that you don't see any way that you could ever bless someone else. And if that describes you, let me just strongly encourage you to take a class that we offer a couple of times a year. It's called Financial Peace University. It features the teaching of Dave Ramsey. You may have heard of him. He's got some incredible insights. It's a 9-week class. It's very practical. It begins February 23rd, goes for 9 weeks. And we've had many people take this class, and it's been amazing to see what's happened in the lives of people who've taken this course. And I believe that if you struggle in this area, and you'd love to be that kind of person who's more of a pitcher than a container, but you don't see how you could ever do it, you take advantage of this. This will not only change your life, but it will change generations, I believe. So you can sign up on our website, parkerhill.org, or you can take that connection card, give us your contact information, check the empty box and put FPU, Financial Peace University, in there, drop it off at the Next Steps area. We'll get you signed up, and that will help you to get to the place where you want to be. Okay? Let me just give you one practical way that we're going to apply what we've been talking about today. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be inviting you. If you consider this your church, and if you indeed are a follower of Christ, we are going to be inviting you to participate in an exercise called 10 for Them. It's the 10 for Them challenge. In fact, there should be a card on your seat at every campus. Go ahead and pick that up. We're not going to ask you to fill this out today or turn this in. I just want to give this to you. I want you to take it home, talk about it, think about it, pray about it, and then we're going to come back and talk about this again next week. Let me tell you why we call this the 10 for Them challenge. See, the reason that we are here today is because hundreds of people over the years have been generous and willing to share. In some cases, giving what we call a tithe or a tenth of their income. See, the reason why we have buildings and why we have staff and why we have properties and why we can gather here today is because people in the past have been generous and opened a door for us. But here's the thing. We believe that the best is yet to come. We believe that our job is not finished yet. We know that there are thousands of people all around us here in northeastern Pennsylvania who are still in hope of search, in hope of truth, in hope of direction, and we want to help them find a home and a spiritual connection with their Heavenly Father. In fact, we have this huge vision we talked about back in May that we would love someday on a Sunday to see 10,000 people gather together to worship. Maybe at the Mohegan Sun Arena, maybe at the PNC ball field, but we'd love to see that happen today. But here's the thing. It's our generosity today that will pave the way for that to happen, that will open up the doors wider for the people who aren't here yet. So we call this the 10 for Them challenge, for the people who aren't here yet, the people who may be your neighbor, your coworker, your family member, your friend. And we call it 10 for Them because that's based on the idea of a tithe or 10%, which was God's standard for His people when it came to generosity. Don't sweat that. We'll talk about that a little bit more next week. For today, I want you to go home and I want you to ask yourself 2 questions, okay? Here they are. How generous am I? Okay, how generous are you, really? And I want you to think about it not in terms of dollars, but in terms of a percentage. Out of everything that's poured into your life, what do you pour back out? Okay, and at the top of that card, there's a scale that goes from 0 to 10. And I want you to think about that. And for some of you, the way you're wired, you know exactly in 2015, what you gave to God and others. Others of you, you're going to have to kind of guess, okay? But where would you put yourself? How generous are you? And then I want you to ask yourself this question. Next question, what is my next step? Because here's what I want to challenge you to do. I want to challenge you to take a next step, a step of obedience, to move toward greater generosity. And we're going to be talking about this in the next couple of weeks. And I'm not even going to ask you to do this like forever. I'm going to say for 60 days, what are you going to commit to in terms of generosity in your own life? And do that for 60 days and see what God does in your heart. See what happens in your life. See how your faith is built. See how God supplies. And here's what our goal is in this process. It's to get 100% participation. Like if you call this your church, if you're a follower of Christ, just to participate at whatever level God calls you to participate. The 10 for them challenge. Not because the church just needs your money, but here's why. Because the world needs our generosity and God wants your heart. So, every week we've had this collective declaration that we've been using, and here it is. God has blessed me with more than I need. I am rich. I will not trust in my riches, but in him who richly provides. I want to add one more sentence to this. This will be the final sentence. Here we go. God has blessed me with more than I need. I am rich. I will not trust in my riches, but in him who richly provides. Because I have more, I will give more and do more. And I want you to say that with me. I know it's kind of long and complicated, but Parker Hill is an above average church, so I know that you can do this with me. Okay, at all 3 campuses, we're going to say this together, okay, just like we mean it. Here we go. God has blessed me with more than I need. I am rich. I will not trust in my riches, but in him who richly provides. Because I have more, I will give more and do more. Now, I don't think the Wilkes-Barre campus was really all in on that one, okay? So I think they can do better. So we're going to do this one more time, and I want you to say this with gusto. I want you to reject the myths of our culture as we say this together. Here we go. One more time. God has blessed me with more than I need. I am rich. I will not trust in my riches, but in him who richly provides. Because I have more, I will give more, and I will do more. In just a moment, we're going to have the band come on back up. We're going to close with a song that we've been using throughout this series. And the lyrics of the song say this: my life is in your hands. I trust it all. I trust it all to you. My dreams and all my plans, I trust it all to you. And that's really what this all comes down to, right? Do we really trust God with everything in our lives, including this part of our lives? But before the band comes back up and before we end with that closing song, I want you to hear an example of what can happen when God's people are willing to be generous and to share with others. I want you to hear the story of one family who came to this church and who found the way back to God here at Parker Hill. Listen to the story of Debbie and Tacky.
After my grandfather passed away in 2009, that's when everybody's relationships just went south from there. I wasn't only grieving for my grandfather, but everybody else that I lost in my life at that time.
That brought our relationship to a halt, and it wasn't good.
I was just at the bottom of the barrel. Like, it just felt like something has got to change in my life. Medications, doctors, psychiatrists, therapists, none of that was really working for me.
Before asking Jesus to come into my life, I was just going through the motions. Nothing really touched me deep inside.
And then when I finally decided to give my life to Christ is when everything changed. I had to realize a lot of things about myself too, that I did wrong, that was hurtful to other people, or, so I had to face that as well. And I had to ask God to forgive me for all of that. Felt awesome when I did,
I asked Jesus, to come into my heart, and he filled me up with love and compassion, and just made me a different person. The first Sunday we came here, we walked in here, and it was just, as soon as the music started and, the lights dimmed, and it was just an overwhelming feeling, and it was just, I felt like this is where I belong at that moment. I knew this is where I have to be. And that was the best decision we ever made.
When we go out and we talk about it with our friends, it's like, it's so awesome. You got to just come and see what it's like, and experience it for yourselves. He had a friend from the hospital that he invited, and now him and his wife come. Actually, she was baptized with us.
Yeah. Everybody needs God in their life. And I can say that this place here, this is where you need to go.
It's where it's at. I'm glad there's a place like Parker Hill that that we're able to come to feel like we're getting closer to God, and we're connecting with people, and we're learning how to grow spiritually. It's great that there's people out there that give their time and their money to make that possible. It's awesome, and I want to be a part of that too.